socio-ecological research as a catalyst for transformative change. And I'm going to be talking today about two things. One, my role just in my own research program, what I'm trying to do to implement the values that underlie socio-ecological research. And I mean values. I didn't say methodologies or conceptual frameworks. And also how we're trying to implement that in LTIR. So we'll go ahead and start with, so basically I'm going to be talking about what this means, social ecology as a tool for transformative change. Well, there's a lot of jargon in the talk, so I'll be defining a few things so people know at least what it is that I'm talking about. We'll talk about how I'm trying to implement it in my own research program, and then we'll look beyond and talk a bit about LTIR after Michael's introduction that he just gave now. This will follow up nicely. So just some terms so we're all kind of understand at least what I'm talking about here. Sustainability transition. It's a multidimensional fundamental transformation of our social technical systems to be more sustainable, okay? That means we're going from something that's fundamentally unsustainable to something that's sustainable, but it's much broader than a few policy decisions or funding or these. It's really looking at the most basic drivers of human behaviors and habits and what it is that's causing such degrees of environmental degradation that we're having a hard time stopping it. And I think the COP27 is happening this week is a great example of how we can have 27 meetings of countries committed to stopping anthropogenic climate change and still not really succeeding and probably not even, certainly not reversing the trends, but not even doing a very good job at slowing down the same trends. It's because we're talking about far more basic human behaviors that are driving that degradation. Transformative change, doing things differently, not just a little more or less of something we're already doing, or the capacity to create a new system when the old one is not working. So I think you understand that no one actually uses the word revolutionary, maybe because it's not politically so correct, but I think we're talking about revolutionary changes in the way society operates, its economic and social systems. Why would we want to do that? Because we are reaching planetary limits or tipping points in any number of ecological realms. If it's nutrient loading in aquatic systems, if it's climate change as we talked about, or if it's species extinctions. This one is particularly interesting graph based on a study that was published in Nature a couple years ago, basically looking at the entire biomass of all the vertebrate species on the planet and looking at what amount of percentage of that biomass is attributed to humans and their domesticated animals. And I hope you join me in being a little bit shocked to realize that all of the wild animals, the undomesticated animals, constitute 4% of the total vertebrate biomass on the planet, which basically underscores that humans in the Anthropocene are controlling basically every ecosystem process at the global level. And you can go on beyond these three. Of course, you can talk about the proliferation of microplastics. You can talk about deforestation. There's any number of global scale environmental challenges in which we're, and this is that famous paper of tipping points by Carl Folk and his colleagues, looking at where we're already past tipping points, planetary tipping points, where we will fundamentally create a different equilibrium and not necessarily an equilibrium where human civilization can thrive. So that's why we're doing what we want to do, because the way we were doing things led to these problems, and we're not going to fix these problems by continuing to do the same things. In a social ecology is both a discipline and a process of doing science, and what I'm focusing today is not on social ecology as a discipline, but rather social ecology as a process. They go hand in hand, but as a transdisciplinary discipline, social ecology also has a particular goal beyond generation of scientific facts. So if we look at it as a discipline, it's fundamentally the interaction between social and biophysical systems and the impact of humans are having on those systems and the changes in the system that affect the quality of life for humans. And we measure the capacity to provide quality of life through ecosystem services. But as a process, it's also driven by the desire to be relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. And in order to be relevant, it has to engage in co-production of knowledge, meaning transdisciplinary, meaning outside of academia, along with all those other societal sectors that also have their knowledge, opinions, values as well. And without recruiting them to address environmental problems collaboratively, we will not alone be able to do it. Because I happen to think that scientists do a very good job in producing the knowledge necessary and the technologies necessary to resolve these problems. The bottleneck is implementing that knowledge and implementing those technologies in such a way that they can have their desired impact. And part of that requires that scientists do a better job of understanding other stakeholder groups and working with them, not convincing, but rather coming to understandings of better ways of doing things that's more acceptable to different stakeholder groups. So a transdisciplinary research project has a research component that directly feeds in to policy and implementation in a constant cycling, an iterative process where the scientist doesn't leave the system as soon as the solution is proposed, but rather continues to monitor and continues to improve and continues to correct when necessary. So this is kind of a long-term collaborative project or an agreement between the scientific community and society that we are going for the long term to work together to solve these problems. And the keywords are down below: collaborative, reflexive, integrative, iterative, and relevant. So how do I make that into something that actually works in academia? 3 pathways, not just the research, but also through teaching, and also the tough one to crack is the administration. So I'm going to be presenting these, but I really want to focus on this one in the end. And at 2 spatial scales: the work that I'm doing in my own country and primarily in my own city, and what I am privileged to be able to do through ELTER, which is one of the best opportunities. Personal advantages for being involved in ELTER is that access to scientists, to communities, to research sites across Europe. So these are some examples of the types of research that goes on. And each one of these research projects has its set of methodologies, results, and conclusions, but I'm not presenting that today. All I want to present is the types of questions that we ask and how we go about answering them. So these are the types of questions we ask, and every one of them was driven by problems we observed at the local scale or problems which were brought to us through policymakers or through citizen groups. So our research program is really driven by the needs of our community around us. So these are some of the examples, a few others which are even more picturesque that we worked about. In 2016, we had a major fire go right through the middle of our city, which led to a large discussion of how we're managing the forested intervals, interspersed forests in our city, and whether we can regulate or we can manage regulating ecosystem services, the ones that will hopefully lower the risk of fire, but at the same time maintain the same cultural values which define our city and define the interaction of our citizens with natural areas. And the other one is my particular favorite. This is actually just a 5-minute walk from my house. We're regularly visited, like many European cities, by wild boar. It's become quite an economic and political challenge, but one that we're trying to resolve by doing ethnographic studies along with different stakeholder groups and trying to generate insights on how to manage, how to plan and to design public spaces to limit the undesired interactions between humans and boars. And I say undesired because most of the population doesn't want them there. There's very few people that do enjoy their presence. There are some, but really we're trying to look out, we're doing a multi-species ethnography, which means that we prioritize both humans and boars at the same level, which in and of itself isn't a very popular approach when you approach citizen groups, but we're working on it in that way. Again, what makes all of these projects similar, or what underlines all these projects, is that they're all looking at interactions between social and ecological systems. They're all important and have direct policy relevance. All of the methodologies require their social science-derived methodologies. If they're interviews, focus groups, Delphi surveys, all kinds of approaches like this, or participatory GIS mapping. And that knowledge that we're derived isn't just something that we integrate into our results, but we go back to the community with our results and we discuss our results with them and modify accordingly when there are policy implications involved. So that's the model that we try to use to encourage kind of transformative science that matters to people and is more effective in addressing local environmental challenges. A broader scale analysis, and here I'll just spend a couple minutes on this particular project, is working with wineries and vineyard farmers to try to increase the biodiversity in their vineyards. This is a particularly appropriate one to show in France, I suppose. But in Israel, it was traditional to clear, using herbicides to clear all the crops. This type of field was considered neater, easier to manage, easier to access, and this was actually the undesirable state. Also because farmers, to some degree incorrectly, were assuming that this would harbor more damaging insects than clearing the area, which it does raise the amount of, the spoiler is it does raise the amount of damaging insects, but also of parasitoid wasps, which kind of keep the populations in check. But what was the project? The project was to address water loss, soil loss, biodiversity loss, and herbicide use in vineyards. And the problem was first promoted that we deal with it was actually introduced by the viticulture, by the winery itself and the chief viticulturist, and we call her our sustainability hero. She basically said, I want my wines to be from herbicide-free vineyards, and I'm gonna make that happen. And she found an NGO, an environmental NGO, to support her and to support research, but their first act was actually to hire ecologists and just to convince some of the farmers to leave some of the fields with cover crops, and then to look at the changes in insect populations, and then try to get the rest of the farmers to change their practices based on the ecological results. And that didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because most of the farmers were very ambivalent. They felt threatened. They felt that they were taking the economic risk and no one was going to be there if these policies didn't work out to be economically profitable or if they were damaging. So and also the first round of ecological results were very ambiguous. It wasn't sure that there would be fewer of the damaging insects and more of the parasitoid insects. So we had this kind of awkward situation where the winery wanted to promote this policy. The farmers were only accepting it because they felt it was being forced upon them, and the ecologists were presenting information that ecologists present. We're with a relatively high probability, we think that this is happening, here's the standard deviation, and work with that. And the farmers don't like working with standard deviations. It doesn't serve their purposes. So that's when we were brought in, and I'm not gonna say we solved everything, but the social scientists and the policy team acted as a sort of bridge to communicate information and to bring all the parties together and to propose forums in a way that wasn't being done before. The way that the science was being done before was that the ecologists did the research, presented their results, and left it at that. What we did was have a series of meetings about the results where they could be explained and discussed in a public forum, where the farmers could respond to what their feelings were or what their reactions were. And some of the changes that we implemented were actually quite minor but meaningful. For instance, the ecologists in the beginning were studying biodiversity. Biodiversity didn't resonate with the farmers. That term, they could be sympathetic or more or less sympathetic, but it wasn't something that they make decisions about. The same set of treatments also affect hydrological flows and soil erosion. And as soon as we started talking about the natural resources within the system, then the farmers were right away on board and saying, you're going to propose something that's going to prevent further soil erosion and conserve water, then I'll start to think about what you're doing. And in this case, they all varied similarly. That is, what was good for biodiversity was also good for preventing soil erosion, which was also good for conserving water in our arid systems. So just the small change in meeting together and discussing results and changing some of the terminology or the variables that were being studied started to have an impact on the farmers. And then, of course, we continued on towards the end, and the final product was actually quite encouraging. All of the farmers within this winery, all of this winery's customers, all transferred to using cover crops. And the technology or the idea started radiating out to other wineries as well. I'm not saying we were the only impact, but this became what was fundamentally a confrontational relationship that may or may not have ended well, and in the end it did end well, and it continues on today. That's not that it's not without some precautions that as of after that conclusion of that funding, the observations didn't continue, the biodiversity surveys didn't continue. One thing we discovered in this research is that the most trusted individuals were government-employed agricultural extension advisors. And that position in our increasingly privatized economy has been eliminated by the government, and it's been replaced by companies, by agrotech companies that now provide free advising to the farmers. Those government farmers were among the most trusted in this whole network. The farmers would basically say they'd do anything that these advisors told them to do. And the advisors were very conservative. They understood the science. They didn't want to advise their farmers in any way that would put them in an uncomfortable economic situation. But unfortunately, those positions have been eliminated by our agricultural ministry, which is unfortunate. And there's no consistent monitoring. These are the tools for success of the project. I'm not going to go over them. Another project, and now scaling up, and here we bring in why ELTER has been helpful for my own research program, studying cultural ecosystem services in nature. I do a lot of research on the way different population groups enjoy different aspects of nature and how that might impact the way we plan and manage our nature reserves and our public green spaces. And I do my work locally, but in this particular project, we already had a built-in infrastructure of collaborators from ELTER, in this case from a platform in Finland and from Scotland and from the Netherlands, and then using ours in Israel. And we conducted the same experiment across the network. And that's really when I envision, okay, what is this good about scaling up, of doing our local regional research, and we want to scale up because we can actually uncover other contextual issues that are very important in defining what these cultural ecosystem services are. The very shallow explanation of our results is that we found two sets of ecosystem services. Some of them were exclusively connected to the type of ecosystem that we were doing the research, whether it was a riparian area, a dune, a desert, or a forest. There were some similar category groups like sounds and the feel, but each one was very, very specific to its own ecosystem type. On the other hand, there were some recurring themes that happen wherever you are in the world, in whatever natural environment, when you communicate with the people in the process. And I didn't explain the methodology. It's called focusing. It's semi-meditative, meditative methodology that you do with your respondents while walking in these areas. But these were the recurring themes that showed up across all sites. So what this basically exemplifies for us is that we can do a research project scaling up across Europe, across different ecosystem types, and discover where context matters and how context impacts the quality of the experience in nature, and where nature in a generic way really functions the same way across different communities and across different countries and ecosystem types. And I quite liked this research. I would like to expand upon it, but I don't have time. But I just wanted to use it to exemplify the benefits of a network. The next project that we have in store for our lab is to look at resilience, socio-ecological resilience to COVID-19. And again, right now we're working on what variables derived from the literature are suggested to imbibe communities with qualities that made them withstand the pandemic better than other communities, and whether those particular characteristics are similar across LTSER platforms in Europe. So this project is just getting off the ground now, but I wanted to show that this is how we're trying to utilize this network. So if we look at, now we're taking it into the teaching regime. The research is the obvious, that's what we do, that's what we're paid to do, that's how we advance ourselves. Everything else is the stuff we're required to do, but we don't put as much thought into the research as we do. I try not to take that approach. Within the teaching that I do, I apply the same socio-ecological model, that I first work with community groups to define what environmental problems they're dealing with, they're grappling with, they don't have answers to. Then I teach environmental policy, and concurrent to teaching theory of environmental policy, our working example is that the students work with that particular problem, consulting the same stakeholders that are dealing with it, and then when they come up with their policy remedies, they present it to the community in the community discussion. And what's nice about this project is several of them take off afterwards and interest policymakers, because we invite them to the presentations. But the one, where's the one? The one on earthquakes? Oh, I didn't put it up. The one we did this year on earthquake safety and loss of open space in the urban setting, we just presented in the City Hall 3 or 4 days ago, and we're hoping that our research will put a stop to the loss of green space in private lots, because as it turns out in our city, about 50% of the urban green space is in private lots. So when people expand the footprint of their building and add parking spaces, the aggregate impact is a significant loss of open space, including street trees, and it's pretty significant. So that one, the one on wild boars, also took off. The one on the relocation of the oil storage facility were all presented to government agencies afterwards. So that's as far as teaching, putting it into the teaching realm. The last one is the institutional behavior. And this is the tough one, and this is the most significant one if you want to make societal change. Much of the conceptual literature now about making sustainability changes talks about most of our existing changes in advocacy are very shallow policy remedies that don't address the core problems. If you can change the institutional behavior, then you can radiate out change that might be much more meaningful. So 3 years ago, I was appointed sustainability officer of my university, and I wanted to take this idea of institutional sustainability change and implement it in my university. So I tried to do these 4 things. I tried to first establish an office of sustainability that's embedded within the university administrative structure, that it would necessarily be part of every university decision from that time forward. If it sounds familiar, it's because I took the idea from many European and American universities that already have that structure, and we didn't. The adoption of explicit sustainability commitments, the systematic monitoring of environmental performance, including carbon emissions, and the integration of research into everything we're doing on campus. That is, if the decision is to move from single-use plastic and cups to multi-use, is that a smart decision environmentally? So like the research that we saw earlier, we did a life cycle assessment of the two alternatives so that when we made our recommendations in the university, it was backed up with scientific, with empirical data that said, yes, this will lead to lower waste both in water and in carbon emissions. And it wasn't immediately obvious. ELTR, we're trying to do the same thing with a lot more success because there's a much more receptive management in ELTR. And in ELTR now, we are undergoing, now this isn't, I'm saying this is happening, this isn't written into our literature, but I want to propose that the sum total of the actions that we're taking as we set up our administrative structure, the actions that we're taking are in fact a sustainability transition. In our own words, in our strategic plan, we are very clear that we are committed that our work and our research is geared towards contributing to global sustainability. So we say it, it's in our words, and it's right up front, and this is the first crucial step, is that it's explicit, and our strategic plan is our reference document. If we ever start to meander and lose our way, we come back to this. This is our compass north. However, sound science is not necessary. It's necessary for the commons, but not sufficient. And this is where we get to that institutional change. The low-hanging fruit in my university and in ELTR is research, because that's what we do. But to change our institution is something different entirely. The traditional model of sustainability is that social, economic, and environmental, balancing them in some magical way so that you have a sustainable future. What was missing from this, and this is actually 20 years old in the literature, but I'm only discovering it in recent years, so it's kind of new to me, is this new aspect of institutional sustainability. That is, you can have these three things in theory, but if you don't have the social and economic institutions to implement it, then these are never going to be much more than theory. And institutions, through a particular set of values towards environmental, towards economic, and towards social, can not only more easily implement change within their community, but the theory is that that change then radiates out to everything that that institution has contact with. And that's the attitude that I was trying to put forward in my university, not so successfully, but I think that's my big hope for ELTR here as well, because it's not just going to be within ELTR, but it's going to be with all of ELTR's stakeholders, and it's going to be with all of the bodies that ELTR interacts with. Now, it's a little bit dangerous now because a lot of the political currents in the world are kind of going against some of these principles that we're trying to promote. I hope that we will continue and not hit a point where we don't want to make political waves and we want to back off a little bit from these kind of what can be perceived as political changes. But for now, these are still words that most people look on as a positive thing that you want in the world you want to create. So it's not just that, that theory says that ELTR should behave this way, or that our own research says that ELTR should behave this way, or that our community has made decisions that we want to undergo this transition. But fortunately, and this also attests to the power of institutions, these are requirements handed down from those organizations that oversee and fund us. So we're not contradicting in our desire to do these things, but the fact that in many cases we have to do them gives the additional push or the impetus to take it seriously. And the fact that these institutions are requiring of all of the organizations that they fund to do a certain set, to engage in a certain set of steps to assure long-term funding and support is a positive change, a positive sustainability shift. What are those things? One is the research philosophy I already went over. Two is the choice of problems that we choose to address, those problems that are at the forefront of European environmental policy, even global environmental policy. And the next step is to create documentation, a paper trail that says we're committed to doing this set of things. I talked about the strategic plan before, but we also now have an approved gender equality plan and an ethical behavioral plan. That ethical behavioral plan has to do with how we do our research, how we collect and distribute our data, how we treat people within our network, and how we behave environmentally. There are four chapters in this ethical guidelines. All of these these two documents, the ethical guidelines and the gender equality plan, have demonstratable action items that say it's not just we're supporting a certain principle, but rather we're going to implement these things in this way. And another way is our commitment to stakeholders. I liked Michael's new slide on stakeholder engagement in his last one, but this is where we mapped out all of the different stakeholders, and it's not just mapping, it's consulting, and it's assuring that our products and our activities are helpful or productive for all of our various stakeholder groups. I should add here also that this represents, or should also suggest, we're building a plan for democratic governance. How is the structure of decisions going to be made? How are different countries going to be represented? What's going to be the relative relationship between stronger countries economically or scientifically and other countries that can't contribute enough? And all of these we debate among ourselves to build proper representation where there's place for everyone around the table and a place for everyone to affect the trajectory of development of the infrastructure. Some of the things that we've done right now, we have annual activities emphasizing the role of women within our research infrastructure. These were the stars of this year's program. We issued a statement about COVID-19. We issued a statement about the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. This will get even better because this year we're establishing our ethical advisory committee and our gender and discrimination ombudsperson. And this will serve as a body that not only makes sure that everything's okay according to our standards, but will help us develop programming that will proactively promote the same values that we expressed in the two documents. The same with the person who will eventually be appointed to do this task. So we're on our way, and early on when we applied for the ESFRI process, Michael produced a slideshow that showed that we directly impact these 8 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And that's all true, but I think even better, this was pre-transformational. Now that we're implementing these other programs dictating how we run our network, I think we can fairly say that we're also significantly contributing to these Sustainable Development Goals, which are often forgotten about by the scientific community because it's not generally considered in the realm of their activities. But when you're undergoing an institutional transformation, then these are no less important in assuring the success of your activities, your pro-sustainability activities, than the actual research that you're doing and the policies that are recommended from there. So with that, I'll conclude. And thanks to my students who contributed all the research to this, and thanks to my ELTER colleagues. And if you think I said sustainability too many times, it's only going to get worse. Because by 2109, every word that anyone's going to say, according to current trajectory, will be sustainability. Thank you very much.